Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever in the world you happen to be. And as I always do, let me express a very special Carnegie welcome to any viewers who might be tuning in from India or Korea, the two countries that are at the core of our discussion this morning, and the countries that are also at the core of the new Carnegie volume that we're going to launch today. It's called Data Governance, Asian Alternatives: How India and Korea are creating new models and policies. And you can read or download the volume from the Carnegie Endowment website, carnegieendowment.org. I'm Evan Feigenbaum. I'm Vice President for Studies at Carnegie. I'm also the co-editor of this volume. I'm the co-leader of a broader project on Korea and the future of technology. And I'm the co-author of the framing chapter in this volume. All of this together with my very good colleague and friend, Mike Nelson, who is a senior fellow at Carnegie for technology policy and is going to moderate the panel that follows. Now, just to take a minute to contextualize this a bit, I'm sitting in Washington, D.C., a city where you hear a lot these days about digital authoritarianism, as people call it. And that's why many people, especially here, have argued that there's going to be a stark contest between democracy and autocracy in the governance of technology and data. A lot of folks will argue, for example, that the world's democracies have open approaches that rely on market mechanisms. The world's autocracies, meanwhile, supposedly privilege the role of the state. They aim to strengthen its capacity to harness data and technology. But this is a very binary framing, and it elides, frankly, the extent to which democracies have, in fact, developed some very diverse approaches. Some democracies, not least in Asia, have adapted policy and regulatory features that deepen and extend the reach of the state. But more, some democracies, again, especially in Asia, have developed data governance regimes that reflect the very unique features of their institutions and also their distinctive political cultures. So I'll give you this headline. This volume makes clear that the world is not, in fact, fracturing into only two spheres: a putative autocratic Sino-sphere dominated by China and an open democratic sphere centered on the transatlantic West. The world is a lot more complicated. There's a lot more mixing and matching. And instead, third and fourth countries, many of which are consolidated democracies and some of which happen to be in Asia, are influencing debates about data policy, the business models of technology firms, and regulatory frameworks. So what our volume does is to highlight some of the alternative models that have originated in India and South Korea. And by comparing these two countries' distinctive approaches through case studies around two issues in particular, open data and cross-border data, we try to show just how much more complex the world will be than the commonplace prediction of a battle between the United States and Europe and China alone. And that's because India and Korea, frankly, are pioneering some of their own approaches. They're mixing and matching approaches and models. They're leveraging their unique democratic institutional frameworks with national requirements, and they're developing policies derived from their own political cultures. And this volume, by the way, is a sequel to an earlier one that we published last year called The Korean Way with Data. And it's part of a big build out that we have here at Carnegie on technology futures in Asia, including in China, Japan, India, Korea, and Taiwan. So I thank you all for tuning in. I hope you'll read, as I said, and download our volume. We're excited about the work. And with that, I'm going to hand it to my friend and colleague, Mike Nelson, who's going to moderate the discussion. So thanks, everyone. And Mike, over to you.
Thank you very much, Evan. And thanks for your leadership on this project and on a number of other tech initiatives. I come at this from the world of tech policy, not geopolitics. And I'm very excited to have been part of this because we are, as Evan said, looking at new ways to approach some of the toughest problems in the digital transformation. I'm a physicist by training, so I look at forces. And one of the big forces in the area of data policy is inertia. Countries have tended to do what they've been doing. The other problem with this particular area is that it's an EGO issue, eyes glaze over. When you talk to a lot of policymakers, this seems pretty unexciting. It seems not as interesting to voters as online privacy or whether Donald Trump should be on Twitter or cyberbullying or government surveillance. But it is fundamental to the development of all the new applications, not just from machine learning and artificial intelligence, but from social media, from new Internet of Things technology. One thing that did put a lot more focus on data policy was the COVID crisis and the need to track patients, track outbreaks around the world. So I think there's a time right now where data policy is the focus higher up in the bureaucratic stack in many governments. And that's particularly true in India and Korea. And one of the reasons we focus on these two countries is because you actually have presidents focused on questions around digital technology. And as two of our authors will explore today, that makes a big difference. It can push forward new initiatives and can force agencies to come together. Even when their policies are pulling in different directions, if you have a push from the top, it can make things happen a lot faster and you can get the consensus needed for effective policy. Before I turn over to our first author, Rahul Madhan, I wanted to make sure that everyone knew that if you want to pose a question, you can do that through YouTube or by typing in Twitter using the hashtag Carnegie Data. I also wanted to thank Alex Taylor, who's behind the scenes today, making this all work and was a key player in organizing the volume. And also wanted to thank the amazing editors in the Carnegie communications team. So now let me turn over to Rahul Madhan, who did a very important chapter on open government data in India. He's with Trilegal. He's also an incredibly prolific writer on tech policy and digital policy in India. I commend something he wrote just 2 days ago on the new telecommunications law in India. It's not only very clear and useful, it's also fun to read. So Rahul, over to you. And if
Thank you.
Explore for us what you think we really need to know about your chapter and open data in India.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you for inviting me to participate on this publication. I think that India's approach to data governance and just generally to all things data is unique in the world because India has adopted what we're starting to call a techno-legal approach to data governance. And what that means is that just as around the world people are either using technology infrastructures for data governance or regulatory infrastructures for data governance, India is looking to merge the two and to have technologies that what I've started to say is that allow regulators to regulate and at the same time and on the same infrastructure allow innovators to innovate. So these frameworks essentially embed into the framework itself, hard code as it were, some of the legal principles that we would like to define through regulation. But because they're embedded directly into the infrastructure, they can have a much more immediate result that the tweaks to those frameworks, to those principles can have a direct and immediate result on the ecosystem. And at the same time, because these are built in a way that allows private enterprise to interface with these infrastructures, does not rely on the thing that the governments do particularly badly, which is innovate and reach out to larger populations and markets. And India has been very successful in doing that in what's called India Stack, which is a layered stack of various digital public goods that together form infrastructure. starting with the identity layer, which is Aadhaar, our national biometric identity system, and layer on top of that the payment infrastructure, and most recently the data sharing infrastructure. And the data sharing infrastructure, I think, is what is the subject of most of the chapter, which essentially, and the approach to open data really is the data locked in silos, silos that potentially would be bank information, financial information, maybe health information, maybe skills, educational information, can then be unlocked with the consent of the user and can flow at the direction of the user from one entity to another entity. And so just as a quick example, if I have information, if there's a lender that has information that they would like to have about my transactions, that could then give me a loan or some sort of financial product. This data empowerment and protection architecture allows the information to flow from, either the bank that has my current information as to what my financial status is, or any other entity that has that information to this lender in a consented, completely digital workflow. And this has been implemented in India in the financial services sector, as I mentioned. After we wrote the paper, 1.1 billion accounts came online in that framework. It is, by all accounts, the largest open banking rollout anywhere in the world. And at the time of writing the paper, you will see that there were about 1 million consents on this framework. The very same framework or similar framework is being applied in the healthcare sector. Once again, data locked in silos in health are moving from one silo to the other. And the last thing I'll say, just to wrap it up in that governance construct, is that within this consented data framework and with these consented data flows, we can embed into them, for instance, principles of privacy like consent and notice, because a notice is actually stipulated in the electronic consent artifact. We can stipulate purposes. We can, and that's the purpose limitation principle. We can stipulate data minimization and, in fact, effect data minimization, because quite frankly, if you can have access to the information whenever you want, you don't need to take all of it up front and keep it for some further time when you may use it. And so for all of these reasons, I think the framework actually, in a sense, embeds a lot of the principles of law into the code. Mike, I think you picked it up when we discussed this. Many years ago, probably 20 years ago, Larry Lessig came up with this book called Code. It was probably the first pop science, pop law book that I ever read. And happy to say that I've been instrumental in working to implement some of those things at population scale in India. And we're very excited to see how these innovations can help the rest of the world.
Well, thank you. And thanks again for being very concise and giving us some good news in terms of data policy. So let me now turn over to K.S. Park, and he was looking at the other side of the issue, which is how countries are restricting cross-border data flows and how that affects how open data and commercial data will be used inside of Korea, inside of India, and elsewhere. So KS, thank you for joining us. I'm glad you were able to be with us here in Washington before you head off to the airport. And KS is a professor at Korea University and also very important, the head of OpenNet, which is one of the few groups advocating for internet users in Korea. He wrote a very important chapter for our last volume, which has actually been the most read and most cited chapter in that volume.
Thank you, Mike. Again, thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about Korea and data governance. Just like Mike, I also was a physicist by training, and in physics, there is this function in special relativity. I thought experiment where a rod, a long rod rotates, and if one end of the rod is rotating at half the speed of light, at what speed is the other end traveling. And there is a question about how fast the data that the other end is traveling at half the speed of light, how fast that information travels to that other end. I'm just trying to, by talking about this thought experiment, I'm not going to try to solve this puzzle. I'm just going to tell you that this idea of information, the idea of data, has pre-existed before the politicians and the companies began to point to that as some sort of oil, some sort of commodity, or some sort of new items, new goods to make money off of. It is very important to understand how data has pervaded our lives. Even we began what we call industry, and this is very important for what I'm going to talk about. So if you think about it, data, acquisition of data is learning, and transfer of data or diffusion of data is speech. So restriction on acquisition of data is restriction on learning, and restriction on diffusion or transfer of data is restriction on speech. So many of restrictions, including cross-border transfer restriction, cross-border data transfer restriction, constitute restriction on freedom of speech. And there's just no way to get around that. You have to face that squarely. And that is important. That is an important lesson that was missed by the Korean policymakers, because when they lost the human rights dimension of the data governance, in terms of restricting learning and restricting speech, Korea began to accumulate many restrictions on online activities and speech activities that just didn't exist in other countries. For instance, internet real name law, where everyone who is everyone writing anything on a major website had to register their Korean equivalent of a social security number, so that they can be tracked down by the authorities when the postings are found to be unlawful. Also, mandatory notice and takedown, which I'm concerned about, because our European colleagues are kind of going back in time and trying to follow Korea's model. And the more famous example is game shutdown law, where people under age of 16 had to stop playing game when Korean clock, the clock in the Korea time zone hits 12 midnight, wherever they are in the world. Now, what these regulations, these unprecedented regulations in Korea disadvantaged many Korean companies, content producers, game operators, and other creators. And that disadvantage, the feeling of being disadvantaged percolated into this argument that for fair competition, there has to be some measure to apply the same law to foreign companies. And as I surveyed data localization initiatives could come from desire for sovereign control of data, for national security, or for reasons of data protection, sometimes fair taxation. But in Korea, the fifth reason for data localization was the strongest, which is fair competition. And that can become in other countries also, as they try to restrict data flow more and more with their own regulations. This argument for fair competition, this argument that domestic companies are tied behind their backs, tied their hands behind their backs in competition against foreign companies, that argument will slowly percolate into data localization initiative. So that is one takeaway, one broad takeaway from my paper, that we should, as we develop more restrictions on data, we should not lose the sight of the human rights angle, to make sure that the new regulations meet the international human rights standard. Otherwise, the regulations that apply only domestically will slowly increase the pressure for data localization. I'll stop there for now. That's one takeaway. I have more to come.
Well, I heard two takeaways, and they were both takeaways that I took away from your papers. The one on how data localization can be viewed as a human rights issue, and then how competition and desire for opportunities for Korean firms has influenced policy in Korea and also elsewhere. Let me now turn it to Stefan, and I'd love to hear from you what barriers you see in Korea, in India, and elsewhere, and what solutions you see. What's getting in the way of your dream, which is data empowering people and companies all around the world?
Yeah, thanks so much, Michael, and thanks Rahul and KS for wonderful contributions here, and congratulations to the Carnegie Endowment for really taking this on. And I think we need a lot more of those kinds of initiatives that really feature what's happening worldwide, right? Too often we get stuck in the models that everyone knows, and we don't learn or feature what's happening in other places that are actually kind of setting a new default or a new model as well. And so, and again, it's a lot of content to be unpacked, but I'm going to try to be brief with regard to some of the elements that are typically challenging, and also from reading the papers, seems to me also challenging within both India and Korea. But before I go there, I think it's important to reflect on why is it that we need new data policies, and that we cannot rely on existing frameworks that were developed, like for instance 30 years ago, when obviously we already had something like the Fair Information Practice Principles that set the standard for a lot of the data policies worldwide. And the main reason is, from my point of view, is that we really, in a current environment where we have a lot more data as a result of digital transformation, the real opportunity lies in actually the reuse of data that was collected for one purpose, that we then start using it for another purpose. And that's why we care about open data. That's why we care about flows of data, so that we actually have access to data so that we can reuse it for other purposes. Now, the problem is that from a policy point of view, we haven't really figured out how to govern reuse. We haven't really figured out how to promote access as well for reuse. And that turns out to be the real headache. And so from my point of view, there are a few elements that need to be taken into account in order to facilitate reuse in a more responsible way. And the first one is to be more intentional about what's the purpose for which one seeks reuse. And too often we focus on data for data's sake, right? Just give me access to the data and I will figure it out. Or just build a stack and we will figure out what we're going to do with the stack. Or just build an open data platform and people will come and use it. Turns out, anyway, the typical field of dreams challenge, if you build it, will they come? Turns out it's not the case. And so we need to actually be far more intentional and purpose specific with regard to what are the priority purposes for which we actually need a data stack, for which we need an open data platform, so that we then can align the supply of data with actually the priority needs. And unfortunately, many data strategies that I have seen never reflect on the purpose. They're all about the data, but not about the questions that one seeks to answer with the data and the process that is needed in order to at least prioritize the purposes for which we need data. And I think that's a big effort and a big, from my point of view, concern, because too often people are surprised. We've done everything. We have now a data platform and we still don't generate value as we had anticipated. And too often it's because we don't spend enough time on the purpose. Second element goes back to what Rahul referred to as the consent issue. And that's the real challenge with reuse, right? Which is typically when, anyway, provide consent for one use, typically the use for which it was collected. But what do we do then with reuse? And of course, what was experimented with in India is kind of interesting because it does allow for kind of reuse consent, at least as I understand it. But the problem with consent is also that it's very binary, right? It's either yes or no, and it's not. Well, I would share it if you change the conditions, right? And so there's no real kind of negotiation opportunity there with regard to how one provides access to data. And then secondly, it's very individualistic, right? It's always about an individual that provides consent, not taking the community's interest into account. And so we need a new kind of approach to what I call a social license for actually reuse of data, where we actually have new processes where we engage with citizens, engage with data subjects as a collective, not as an individual kind of exercise. So that's a second challenge, is how do we go beyond individual consent and also take into account the concerns that certain communities might have, especially anyway in places where there are, of course, marginalized communities as well. Very quickly, Michael, the third one I would say is that we need actually new professions to even implement the kind of policies that we have, right? And so we quite often assume that anyway, if we have policies, then it will be fine. But who is actually is going to be tasked to actually make this work? And more importantly, who's going to be tasked to customize the approach based upon the policies and the principles that you have? Because there is actually a lot of customization needed in order to provide a solution that is fit for purpose. And so that's where, from my point of view, we need a lot more work on data stewards. We need a lot more work on actually building that kind of new profession that can steward data according to the principles that were agreed upon within a particular kind of national or local context as well. The fourth concern from my point of view is that, yes, and then I will stop, Michael, is that we actually need to also think about what are we then actually going to do with the data and the insight. And too often we declare victory if we have access to data, but we never really reflect on how do we go from data insight to action, right? And to ultimately better decision making. And that's something that, anyway, Michael, we can talk about whenever there is an opportunity, but that's something to consider as well. And
the fourth topic, I think, is something we should do a multi-volume study on. And if you do want to dig deeper on the topics Stefan just mentioned, the GovLab at New York University, where he works, has done some incredible work. I urge you to check out their website. Let me now turn to Naomi Wilson, who works for ITI, the leading trade association for the tech sector here in Washington and in the country. And she's been working across Asia on a whole range of tech policy issues, including data localization. She's been on another discussion we had a few months ago and was part of the review team for these papers. And I really want to thank you for all that you've done and all that you've helped us with, Naomi. So over to you.
Yeah, my pleasure. So it's great to be with you all this morning, afternoon, evening. Just a couple of thoughts in terms of what we want other countries to learn from the examples of Korea and India. Both are at really interesting times in their history. I was just in New Delhi the week before last with our CEO, and we heard a lot about the success stories that India has had recently with the Universal Payment Initiative and the digitization of vaccination records, including for COVID. These are exceptionally impressive accomplishments, and they've all happened within the last few years. And we heard stories about how the universal payment platform, which has basically turned India into a cashless society, has really lifted a lot of people up into the financial sector, people who didn't have a bank account, at all. And so it opens doors for people in new and different ways that I think we sometimes don't think about when we think about data policy in the abstract. So India has a great story to tell, and I hope that they do tell that, including through events such as the G20, which they'll be hosting next year. However, they have a few regulations where it seems like the economic benefits of data and data free flows have not fully been recognized. We saw that they pulled back the personal information protection bill, and we expect to see a new version of that coming out soon. But it's like old habits die hard, right? Like on the one hand, you have these examples of how greater freedom in the data policy world has really done great things for Indian society. And on the other, you have some of the most restrictive regulations in the world on data localization and the inability to recognize fully that those types of policies will ultimately hurt Indian companies just as much as the foreign competitor companies. Because if you can't export that data, if you can't send your digital services across the border, then you're not going to reap the economic benefits. You're not going to reach the broader market. And I think that will be a big part of India's ambition to reach a $1 trillion export economy. On the Korea side, also an interesting time for Korea, as they're still in the process of initiating a new administration, the Yoon administration. They've been very frank about their desire to have a more pro-self-regulation model and to re-examine certain policies, such as their cloud services procurement policy restrictions that have required localization and really prevented non-domestic companies from competing in the cloud market. And so I think that that's a really good sign, and we should be looking to see what they will do in terms of implementation. That's another one where I feel like Korea is very well positioned, not only in the region, but globally, to show what the tangible benefits of smart data policy are, what the economic benefits are, how you attract businesses to really become a digital hub. And right now with both countries, I think it's it's too soon to say which direction they're going to go in. They're kind of like teetering at this point, and I hope it goes one way in favor of a better and more open data policy, but that remains to be seen, and we'll be watching that closely.
Well, thank you very much for teeing up a number of issues very concisely. Our last speaker is Lorraine, and she is somebody I met when she was working at the OECD, doing a lot of work on digital policy. She's now with the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network, where she leads their DataSphere initiative. We've laid out a lot of challenges. I hope you'll add to that list, but I also hope you might address the question of vision and the vision of the data sphere, where data flows to where it's needed and can be used for all the purposes Naomi just mentioned. So Lorraine, over to you. And thanks again. I gave you about 24 hours notice on this because we needed to fill a seat, and you stepped up. So thank you very much for doing that.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for the invitation. It was a pleasure to contribute to the discussion during the development and review of the different papers as well. And first, I want to commend the authors of conceiving this report in itself. And to producing it. I think it's a great contribution that echoes the importance of going beyond the binary. And for me, it's because talking about vision, narratives and metaphors that we have for data have really shaped the world. And on the other hand, the scarcity of narratives can also have a very limiting impact on us imagining a more inclusive, trustworthy, and sustainable digital future. And in 2021, we published a report called We Need to Talk About Data, which delved exactly on those issues: free flow of data versus data sovereignty. And we tried to look into alternative narratives that are not so polarized, and trying to understand the legitimate concerns that drive the different narratives that we have. And the report also introduced the concept that you mentioned, the data sphere, so that we could think about data from a more integrated viewpoint. And the reason why we need an integrated approach to data is because dealing with data governance is very, very complex, as all the other speakers have mentioned. It involves a number of norm setters, not only public, but also private, multiple policy silos, and also a multitude of objectives that often contradict each other. And so now I'll just take a moment to explain a little bit what we're doing in the DataSphere initiative, because it connects to the question on narratives and diversity of viewpoints. And the report that I mentioned catalyzed the incubation of the DataSphere initiative within the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network, which was publicly announced during the G7 meeting in Germany in April, and just incorporated as a non-for-profit foundation in Switzerland this month, so very recently. And in aligning our effort is the understanding that because data governance is so complex, we need a system approach that takes into account not only the sum of all data, both personal and non-personal, but also the interrelations with norms and human groups. And the concept of the DataSphere aims to offer an innovative and integrated approach on how we deal with data. And it enables an alternative avenue that goes beyond that binary. And for us, going beyond the dichotomy means also building agile frameworks that unlock the value of data for all. And we do this through a three-pronged approach: enabling a global dialogue on data governance, gathering more intelligence on what works and what doesn't, and experiment with innovative approaches. And that has everything to do with the report that we're discussing today, because it adds to the global debate on data governance. And for me, a major contribution of this report is showcasing the diversity of initiatives and narratives, as others have mentioned as well, particularly when they are pioneering new approaches rather than just emulating what already exists. We need more efforts in gathering the voices from the global south, particularly by engaging those different stakeholders in dialogues. And doing so not only to empower them within the global agenda, but also to help us identify innovative practices and to inform alternative solutions as well. So mapping who's doing what, both from the perspective of policies efforts from the public sector, as well as from the private sector. And we have one example of an effort that we have done as well in this regard, which is the Data Street Governance Atlas, aiming to really understand who's doing what around data governance. We plan to continue doing that work. And interestingly, the report also brings important message of convergence, particularly regarding the challenges faced by policymakers in developing a clear and consistent vision and strategy for data. And that is ultimately what we see in all conversations that we've had with different stakeholders throughout the globe. Everyone's struggling with the same issue of balancing different, often conflicting policy objectives, and also to implement tools and institutional frameworks that don't really seem fit for purpose right now. And the Indian-Korean experiences really capture that challenge very well. And they also capture the importance of strong leadership at the highest level of government to enable real and sustainable change. And so to the question, how do we reduce the barriers to implementing effective policies, right? For me, we need to ask first, how do we continue to learn from these experiences? How do we leverage innovations, even if they're centralized or federated, stemming from governments or articulated by actors developing new models such as data trust, cooperatives, unions, fiduciaries, and also ask ourselves, how do we inaugurate a new era of policymaking for data that does not solely rely on linear regulatory processes? And one of the things that we are exploring in different parts of the world are starting to explore is the notion of creating spaces for experimentation as well. And here I'd like to mention sandboxes as a tool to really experiment on what's working, what it isn't, instead of just relying on a process of consulting stakeholders, of developing a regulation, and then seeing if it works in reality. And echoing what Stefan said, we need to be intentional about those processes and really see how they connect with real world problems that we have, rather than just thinking from a principles perspective. So wherever innovation is impeded by uncertainty, there is opportunity to apply a sandbox model to unlock opportunities. And that would be the first step, really, in terms of understanding how that works. And I leave it here.
Okay. Thank you, Lorraine. Thank you very much for getting into the vision question. We have at least 4 very good questions that have come in over YouTube, some of them having to do with data ownership and the privacy of data about me, but a couple about competition and antitrust. And that's where I'd like to take us now. And we're in the last 15 minutes, so we're going to focus on coming up with headlines and tweets, because as we all know, that's often the way new policy initiatives are announced and how their champions push them through the political process. So let's get some headlines and some tweets about how we can ensure competition and that can drive innovation, can drive investment in new data services. And this is not just competition between companies, this is also competition between agencies that might have different ideas about how to get their data out to the people who can use it best. So, and to be very specific, since next year, the Indian government will be in charge of G20. And there has been an effort there to push behind the headline, data free flow with trust, which came from Prime Minister Abe in Japan. What should the headline be for next year if we really want to push more competition, more innovation? This is the fundamental problem, if you ask me. It's really government trying to control, and on the other side, the private sector and innovators trying to compete to come up with new things that might not be anticipated by governments or even welcomed by governments. So I'm going to turn to you, Lorraine, if you have a dream headline that you'd like to see, and then I'll turn to Rahul and anyone else who thinks there's an organizing principle that could change the debate about how data flows around the world. So I know that's a big challenge, Lorraine, and I didn't warn you, but give us the 6 or 7 words that could change the debate.
Well, that is going to be easy because I spent a long time thinking about what are those words when we're conceiving the mission of what we want to do with the Datasphere Initiative, which is building agile frameworks to responsibly unlock the value of data for all. Each one of those words matter because you need to consider the value of data that has often been forgotten, as Naomi mentioned, in terms of what free flow of data can bring to us. But you need to do so at the same time guarding for the risks that exist in a way that does so responsibly. And agile is just thinking about new ways of doing that rather just using old tools.
I particularly like the phrase "for all." So Rahul, you're an analyst and also a journalist. What's the headline? What do you want Mr. Modi standing up and saying?
I'm terrible at tweet length comments, but so I mean, essentially the whole model in India was built around this concept of empowerment. And I think, it's resonated around a lot of the conversations here. So if I was to choose something, it would be something along the lines of digital infrastructures for data empowerment. And I would cut this, I would have this, you framed it in the context of governments and private sector, but equally within the private sector. There are data silos that if we can unlock and if we can allow the people to whom the data pertains, the data users, what in India we call the data principals, if we can allow them to direct where the data is going to go, I think we will be able to create new and powerful frameworks that will achieve a lot of the vision of what Lorraine mentioned, and I think Stefan also articulated.
Anybody else have a tweet or a headline that we want to see next year?
Well, Michael, if I may, I think from my point of view, it's really about addressing asymmetries that currently stand in the way for competition and also better collaboration. And so we have data asymmetries between those that need data and those that have data. And so we haven't figured out to match that. We have information asymmetries. Quite often we don't know who has data and what is being done with it. And we also have computational asymmetries. You might have data, but you cannot basically use it because you don't have the computational power. And so we have a lot of asymmetries that stand in the way for actually unlocking the real value. And I think focusing on those is going to be really important moving forward.
Yeah, and that comes with the empowerment
Exactly.
issue that Raul mentioned. KS, Naomi?
My headline will be, I mean, there is a data and there's a personal data. More friction is around personal data. So I have a headline for personal data that is trust data subjects. I say this because after data protection law have caught on around the world, I mean, nowhere can personal data be used without some sort of a consent mechanism. But the problem is even after individuals give broad consent over how the data is used, often data protection authorities come in and say, oh, that consent was not specific enough. And without really checking with the individuals, just hit with sanctions and penalties for use of the data or reuse of the data, and also I mean, it's really weird. Korea adopted the GDPR style pseudonymized data concept, but the law has a provision that GDPR doesn't have, which is it just absolutely banned re-identification of pseudonymized data, which means if the pseudonymized data is legally prohibited from being re-identified, that means that it is anonymous data. It is anonymous data, and data protection law doesn't apply at all. What's more difficult is that after their data is pseudonymized and used for scientific research and etc., if they want to exercise their access right, if they want to check how their data is used, because they cannot be re-identified, there's no way of exercising their access right. Within data protection law, there is a right to give consent. That's one part of it. But the other part is right of access. But for some reason, as Stefan said, so much focus has been put on individuals' right to consent, even like beyond the level that individuals are concerned about, that these other rights of their subjects are being actually impoverished by the data protection law that's supposed to protect them. Trust individuals, trust us. We know what we know how to control our privacy. When we go out, we cover all our body except our face, because we want to be recognized as a unique person. There's a reason why we leave our face open even when it's cold outside, right?
Yeah.
So trust individuals.
Okay. Well, I think the other side of that is transparency. I mean, if we're going to trust individuals, they have to know what's happening to data about them. I actually use the phrase mutually assured disclosure. I will give you more data, but you're going to have to tell me a heck of a lot more about what data you have, how you're protecting it, and how you're sharing it. Naomi,
that's the access right.
Right. So Naomi, I'm going to turn it to Naomi for again. This is a tough exercise.
I'll be brief. Here's the Twitter line that I would use is make goods and digital services in India for the world.
Okay. So let me move to one last question, and this is something that I thought was very important in the chapters, and that is this idea that cross-border data flows isn't just a business issue or a national security or law enforcement issue. It's also a human rights issue, and it works both ways. In Europe, the argument is we need to keep data in Europe because we have better privacy laws. But in other places, including in Korea, there's a desire by some citizens to move their data offshore so that it will be beyond the reach of Korean law enforcement or surveillance, or at least if the Korean government is going to have access to data about them, they have to go through a number of extra steps. So is this something that we see in India, Rahul? Is this a discussion that is going to influence the debate? Are people in India saying, I want to use these foreign services, let me move my data wherever I want to move it?
So I think so. I mean, I think India's from before 2018, which is when we first heard of data localization. India's that's the way India has worked. All of India's data industry, the entire data economy, has been built on keep the data where it's most convenient and most efficient to keep the data, and let it flow to where it's most convenient and most efficient to flow to. In some instances, that is absolutely keep it in India, but in other instances, it is not. But I think even within India, there is at least on the part of the government, there is a concern that if data is not near shore or kept somewhere where it is easy for law enforcement to access, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to access. And that's the genesis for a lot of the data localization provisions. I know KS had a different view as to why localization is happening in India. In my view, even though it's never been stated that openly, it is this access issue which is driving the localization issues. This is not what Indian business feels. I think Indian business has always felt that they need the ability to keep data wherever it's most efficient. I would just say, if you look at the trajectory of the various drafts of the data protection law, since you want me to be the bearer of good news, Mike, every successive draft has diluted the rigor of the data localization principles. As you know, we've withdrawn the bill from Parliament, and a new bill is imminent. And if we follow the trend lines, I hope we're going to see an even further dilution of the localization principles. Certainly, that is, in my view, in the interests of both Indian companies as well as foreign businesses that are working in India, and that India is very much looking to invite to continue to work in India.
And I look forward to reading your assessment when the drafts start circulating, as well as those from ITI and the other people on this call. The last point I'll make, I'm sort of the technologist and resident futurist, and I would make the point that in just a few years, we're going to have 50 or 100 devices, each that interact with the cloud, and will probably be even more mobile than we are today. I just finished a 7-country round the world tour. My data was being collected in a lot of different places, from Abu Dhabi to Malaysia to Tokyo. And how you manage data localization and silos in a world where we're all moving and we're generating data from all these dozens of devices, it doesn't quite work. It's the old challenge of government control versus the chaos and competition and choice that technologists and competitors and innovators create. I want to thank you all again. I want to particularly thank Evan for pulling together this project, and thank the Korea Foundation for funding it. We have a third piece of this coming in the next few months, looking at how countries influence technology and the standards that shape them. I do hope that everyone on this call will dig a little deeper, look at the chapters, and also look at the work of our authors who have been working in this area for a very long time. So thank you very much. Great discussion, and I particularly like the tweets, some of which I'm going to have to tweet after the fact. Take care.
Thank you.